Story 1: The Watcher. Emma and Michael were an ordinary couple, searching for a peaceful retreat from their stressful city lives. They stumbled across an Airbnb listing for Serenity Cabin, a charming wooden house nestled deep within the Vermont wilderness. The photos looked idyllic: rustic decor, a wood-burning fireplace, and an expansive view of the surrounding forest. The host's description promised tranquility and privacy. Escape to the heart of nature. This cabin is the perfect place to unplug and unwind. Surrounded by pristine woods with no neighbors for miles, Serenity Cabin offers a chance to reset. Michael had always been a skeptic of listings that seemed too good to be true, but Emma, who loved spontaneous trips, convinced him to book the weekend stay. The drive up was uneventful. As they reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, their cell service flickered out, replaced by complete isolation. Emma joked about it being the perfect horror movie setup, but Michael brushed it off with a laugh. When they finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the photos: quaint, warm, and inviting. However, one detail immediately caught Emma's attention. Hanging just above the doorframe was a small, weathered horseshoe nailed upside down. She dismissed it as a harmless superstition, though she couldn't quite shake a creeping unease. Inside, everything appeared normal. A cozy living room with a plush sofa faced the fireplace. The kitchen was stocked with basic necessities, and a narrow staircase led to the single loft bedroom. But there was something off. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the entire cabin felt colder than the temperature outside. Emma and Michael spent the first day hiking, cooking dinner together, and playing cards by the fireplace. As the night fell, the cabin seemed to shift. The sounds of the forest outside grew louder, branches snapping, the distant call of an owl, and something else: faint tapping noises. "Probably just the trees," Michael said when Emma pointed it out. "The wind makes them creak." Emma nodded, but as they climbed into bed, she found herself staring at the shadows the moon cast on the walls. The tapping continued sporadically, sounding closer each time. Eventually, exhaustion won, and they fell asleep. Around 3 a.m., Emma awoke suddenly. The tapping had grown louder and more deliberate. She nudged Michael, whispering, "Do you hear that?" Before he could respond, they both froze. A soft scrape sounded from the bedroom window. They turned to see faint handprints smudged on the frosty glass. The handprints were small, like those of a child. Michael bolted out of bed, grabbing the flashlight he had packed. He opened the window, shining the beam into the woods, but there was no one there. "Probably some kids messing around," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Kids? Out here?" Emma whispered. "We're in the middle of nowhere." Michael closed the window and locked it. "Let's go back to sleep." The next morning, Michael searched the perimeter of the cabin for signs of trespassers, but found no footprints in the frost-covered grass. Emma, meanwhile, decided to organize their belongings. While putting away clothes in the closet, she discovered a small, handwritten note taped inside the door. The note read, "Do not stay here after dark." Emma called Michael upstairs. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, holding the note. He stared at it, frowning. "It's probably just a prank left by the last guest," Michael said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Then why didn't the host remove it?" Emma argued. "Should we tell them?" "No service, remember," he reminded her. "We can ask them about it when we leave. Let's not overthink it." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Throughout the day, the unease gnawed at her. The forest, which had felt inviting the day before, now seemed ominous. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The tapping started earlier that night. This time, it wasn't just from one direction. It came from all sides of the cabin. Emma and Michael sat in the living room, tense and alert. Michael suggested turning on some music to drown out the noise, but Emma refused. "What if it's an animal?" she asked. "Then we'll scare it off." Michael grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside, leaving Emma alone in the cabin. The door creaked as it shut behind him. Emma sat frozen on the couch, every muscle in her body tense. Minutes passed like hours until Michael finally returned. "Nothing out there," he said, locking the door behind him. "Just the wind." Emma didn't argue. They decided to sleep in the living room, close to the fire. Michael stoked the flames while Emma laid out blankets on the sofa. They drifted into an uneasy sleep, but Emma woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, the tapping was coming from inside the cabin. Emma shook Michael awake, whispering, "Someone's inside." He grabbed the fireplace poker, and they both listened intently. The tapping grew louder and more deliberate, echoing from the kitchen. Michael motioned for Emma to stay put as he crept toward the kitchen. The floorboards groaned under his weight, masking the sound of the tapping. As he rounded the corner, he froze. The back door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. "Michael?" Emma's voice quivered from the living room. "Stay there," he said, stepping outside to look around. The flashlight illuminated the forest edge, revealing nothing but shadows. He turned back to the cabin, and that's when he saw them. Footprints, bare human feet, circling the house. Michael bolted back inside, slamming the door shut. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "What? Now?" Emma asked, panic rising. "Yes, now." They hastily packed their belongings, throwing clothes into bags without care. As they loaded the car, Emma noticed something that made her stomach drop. Scratched into the wooden porch, directly beneath the front door, were 3 words. "You are watched." "Michael, look," she said, pointing. Michael followed her gaze, his face pale. "Get in the car," he ordered. But when Michael turned the key in the ignition, the car wouldn't start. He tried again and again, but the engine refused to turn over. "That's not possible," Michael muttered. "It was fine this morning." The tapping resumed, louder than ever. It came from the trees now, surrounding the car. Emma screamed as something slammed against her window, a face, pale, gaunt, and grinning. Michael jumped out of the car, screaming at the figure to leave them alone, but the face disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Emma was hyperventilating, her hands gripping the dashboard. "Let's run," she said. "We can't stay here." Grabbing a flashlight in Emma's hand, Michael led her into the forest, following the dirt road they had driven in on. The tapping continued, now echoing from the treetops. As they ran, Emma glanced back and saw them, figures darting between the trees, always just out of view. After what felt like hours of running, they emerged onto the main road. The first rays of sunlight were breaking through the trees. A passing truck stopped to help them, and the driver agreed to take them to the nearest town. When they explained what had happened to the local authorities, they were met with blank stares. The officer in charge sighed and said, "That cabin's been abandoned for years. We've had multiple complaints, but nothing's ever found." Emma and Michael exchanged horrified looks. When they returned with the police to retrieve their belongings, the cabin was empty, the back door still swinging open. Their car was still in the driveway, but the scratches on the porch were gone. To this day, neither Emma nor Michael knows who or what was watching them that night in Serenity Cabin. Story 2. The Hidden Room. Claire was scrolling through Airbnb late one night, searching for a weekend escape to celebrate her 30th birthday. She wasn't looking for anything extravagant, just a quiet place where she could relax with her 3 best friends, Danielle, Lucy, and Amanda. When she stumbled upon Hidden Pines Chalet, the listing seemed perfect. It was a secluded 3-story house nestled in the mountains of upstate New York, with a hot tub, game room, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a dense pine forest. The photos were stunning, and the price was almost suspiciously affordable. The host, Roger, had glowing reviews about how helpful and responsive he was. Without a second thought, Claire booked it. As the weekend approached, the group excitedly planned their trip, deciding to drive up together in Amanda's SUV. Claire noticed one odd detail in the booking confirmation. Roger had included a single sentence at the very end of his welcome message. "Whatever you do, don't use the door at the end of the second-floor hallway." Claire shared the message with her friends, assuming it was a quirky joke or a way to keep guests from entering a private storage area. They laughed about it, imagining scenarios straight out of a bad horror movie. Still, they agreed to heed the instruction. It wasn't their house after all. The group arrived on Friday evening. The chalet was even more breathtaking in person. The walls were lined with dark wood, giving it a rustic charm. And the living room had a massive stone fireplace. The kitchen was stocked with modern appliances, and the hot tub on the deck bubbled invitingly. They chose their rooms and began unpacking. As Claire and Lucy carried their bags upstairs, they noticed the door Roger had mentioned. It was located at the very end of the hallway, standing slightly ajar. Unlike the other doors in the house, which were painted white, this one was dark brown with an iron handle. "Creepy," Lucy whispered, nudging the door with her foot. It creaked open slightly but stopped halfway, as if something heavy was blocking it from the other side. "Don't," Claire said, tugging Lucy's arm. "Let's just leave it alone." Lucy shrugged, but she couldn't resist peeking through the narrow crack. "It's pitch black in there," she said. "No windows, no lights." "Roger said not to mess with it," Claire reminded her. Lucy rolled her eyes and let the door swing shut. That evening, they cooked a big dinner, played card games, and drank wine by the fireplace. The house felt warm and cozy, and for a while, they forgot about the mysterious door. But as the night wore on, little things started to feel off. Lucy swore she heard faint footsteps on the second floor while everyone was downstairs. Amanda claimed the back door had been locked earlier, but found it slightly open when she went to grab a drink from the deck. "Old house quirks," Danielle said dismissively. "Wood creaks, doors settle, it's nothing." But Claire couldn't shake a nagging unease. As they climbed into bed, she found herself staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan the house made. Around 2 a.m., Claire woke up to the sound of a low thump. She sat up, her heart racing, and strained to listen. The sound came again, another dull thump, like something heavy falling onto the floor. It was coming from the second floor. Gathering her courage, Claire grabbed her phone for light and crept out of her room. The hallway was eerily quiet, and the air felt colder than before. As she approached the end of the hall, her breath caught in her throat. The door was wide open. Her flashlight beam revealed a set of stairs descending into darkness. She called out softly, "Hello?" But there was no response. The sound of her own voice echoed faintly, as if the space beyond the door was much larger than it appeared. Before she could take another step, something clattered behind her, a loud crash from the kitchen. Claire bolted downstairs, where she found Amanda standing in her pajamas, staring at a shattered glass on the floor. "It just fell," Amanda said, wide-eyed. "I didn't touch it." Claire didn't mention the open door. She didn't want to scare the others, or admit how much it was scaring her. The next day, the group explored the nearby trails and took photos by a frozen creek. For most of the day, Claire kept quiet about the incident. But as the sun set, she finally told Danielle what had happened. "Maybe it's just a storage space," Danielle said, though she didn't sound convinced. "It's more than that," Claire insisted. "The stairs. It didn't look like a normal room." Danielle promised they'd check it out together later, just to ease Claire's mind. That evening, as the group gathered for dinner, the tension in the air grew palpable. Strange things continued happening. Lights flickered, the sound of faint whispers came from empty rooms, and cold drafts swept through the house despite the roaring fireplace. Lucy, who had been skeptical at first, finally admitted, "I don't think we're alone in this house." Unable to ignore the growing unease, Claire and Danielle decided to investigate the door after everyone else had gone to bed. Armed with flashlights and a kitchen knife, they approached the door at the end of the hall. To their horror, the door was open again, revealing the dark staircase. This time, they both noticed something they hadn't before, deep scratches on the inside of the doorframe, as if someone had clawed at it. "Maybe we shouldn't," Danielle began, but Claire was already descending. The stairs led to a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with strange symbols carved into the wood. In the center of the room sat an old wooden chair, tilted slightly to one side. Chains dangled from the ceiling, rusted and broken. The air smelled faintly of rot. "What the hell is this?" Danielle whispered, her voice trembling. Before Claire could respond, they heard the unmistakable sound of the door slamming shut above them. Their flashlights flickered as a low growl echoed from the darkness. Claire and Danielle scrambled up the stairs, pounding on the door and screaming for help. From the other side, they heard Lucy and Amanda shouting, trying to open it. "It won't budge!" Amanda yelled. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the room. Claire turned, her flashlight illuminating something that made her blood run cold. A figure stood at the base of the stairs, its face obscured, but its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The door suddenly burst open, and Lucy and Amanda dragged them out. They slammed the door shut, wedging a chair under the handle. The growling stopped, but the scratches began, something clawing at the door, trying to get out. The group didn't wait until morning. They threw their belongings into bags and fled the chalet, leaving the door barricaded. As they drove away, Claire glanced back and swore she saw a figure standing in the second-floor window, watching them leave. When they contacted Airbnb to report the incident, they were told the listing had been removed. Roger never responded to their messages, and the chalet's location was removed from the site. To this day, Claire doesn't know what was behind that door, or why Roger warned them not to open it. All she knows is that she'll never rent another Airbnb in the middle of nowhere again. Story 3: The Caretaker's Shadow. Megan and her husband Ethan desperately needed a vacation. After a grueling year of work, the idea of escaping to a charming lakeside Airbnb sounded like heaven. Megan spent hours browsing listings before settling on one that seemed perfect: Lakeside Haven. The photos showed a rustic 2-story cottage perched on the edge of a serene lake. It was surrounded by dense pine trees, with a wooden dock stretching out over the water. The host's profile seemed friendly and welcoming, describing the property as a hidden gem with breathtaking sunsets. One detail caught Megan's attention. The property was advertised as having an on-site caretaker who lived in a small cabin nearby, ready to assist with anything you need. Ethan was skeptical. "A caretaker? Sounds like a horror movie setup," he joked. But Megan brushed off his concerns. "It's probably just an older man who keeps up the property. It's not like he'll be bothering us." They booked it for a long weekend, packed their bags, and hit the road, eager for some peace and quiet. They arrived late in the afternoon, greeted by the golden glow of the setting sun reflecting off the lake. The cottage looked just like the photos, cozy, secluded, and picture perfect. Megan immediately fell in love with the place, snapping photos of the lake and the tall trees surrounding it. As they unloaded the car, Megan noticed the caretaker's cabin. It sat at the edge of the property, partially hidden by trees. It was small, weathered, and dark, with no signs of activity. Megan assumed the caretaker was out running errands or inside resting. After settling in, the couple opened a bottle of wine and sat on the dock, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The silence was almost unnerving. No traffic, no voices, just the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. "Can you believe we get this place to ourselves?" Megan said, leaning against Ethan. He smiled. "It's perfect." But as the shadows lengthened, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced back toward the caretaker's cabin, but it remained dark and lifeless. That night, they heard noises outside. At first, it was faint, a soft crunching, like footsteps on gravel. Megan dismissed it as an animal, but Ethan insisted on checking it out. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped onto the porch and scanned the property. "What do you see?" Megan called out. "Nothing," Ethan replied, though his voice sounded unsure. He came back inside, locking the door behind him. "Probably just a deer." Megan didn't push the issue, but as she lay in bed, she thought about the caretaker. Was he watching them? Why hadn't he introduced himself yet? The next morning, they woke to find a small basket on their porch. It contained fresh eggs, bread, and a handwritten note. "Welcome to Lakeside Haven. Let me know if you need anything. Henry, caretaker." "Well, that's thoughtful," Megan said, though she couldn't shake the eerie feeling the note gave her. Why hadn't Henry knocked or introduced himself? Ethan shrugged. Maybe he's just shy. They spent the day kayaking on the lake and hiking through the woods, trying to make the most of their getaway. But as they returned to the cottage that afternoon, Megan spotted something strange. Deep in the woods, near the caretaker's cabin, she saw a figure standing perfectly still. He was too far away to make out any details, but his posture was unnatural, rigid and hunched, as though he were leaning toward the cottage. When she blinked, he was gone. That evening, as they cooked dinner, there was a sudden knock at the door. Megan froze, gripping the handle of the pan she was holding. Ethan answered the door to find a man standing on the porch. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with sunken eyes and a gaunt face. His clothes were faded and hung loosely on his thin frame. "Hi," the man said, his voice low and raspy. "I'm Henry. Just wanted to check in. Make sure you've got everything you need." Ethan smiled politely. "Thanks, Henry. We're all set." Henry didn't smile back. His eyes drifted past Ethan, scanning the interior of the cottage before settling on Megan. He stared for a moment too long, making her skin crawl. "Well," he said finally, "if you need anything, you know where to find me." Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his cabin. Ethan shut the door. "Friendly guy?" he said sarcastically. Megan shook her head. "He gives me the creeps." "Don't worry," Ethan said, pulling her into a hug. He's harmless. But Megan wasn't so sure. The noises started again that night. Footsteps circled the cottage, accompanied by the faint sound of humming. Megan clung to Ethan, too afraid to look outside. By morning, they discovered muddy footprints leading from the caretaker's cabin to their porch. "Okay, this is getting weird," Ethan said, his voice tense. Megan wanted to leave, but Ethan insisted they stay. "It's probably just some misunderstanding," he said. "Let's talk to him." Reluctantly, Megan agreed. They walked to the caretaker's cabin, but when they knocked, there was no answer. Peering through the window, they saw the inside was barren. No furniture, no personal belongings, just an empty space coated in dust. "Is this some kind of joke?" Megan whispered. They returned to the cottage, unnerved. That evening, they kept the curtains drawn and double-checked the locks on every door and window. Around midnight, Megan woke to the sound of creaking floorboards. She shook Ethan awake, whispering, "Someone's inside." Ethan grabbed a fireplace poker and tiptoed toward the living room. Megan followed, her heart pounding. As they turned the corner, they saw a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the room. It was Henry. His back was to them, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Henry?" Ethan called out. The figure didn't move. Ethan stepped closer, raising the poker. "Hey, what are you doing in here?" Suddenly the figure turned, but it wasn't Henry, at least not anymore. The face was distorted, the features stretched and twisted. Its mouth opened unnaturally wide, emitting a guttural growl that made Megan scream. Ethan swung the poker, but the figure vanished before it could make contact. The air grew icy and the lights flickered. Megan grabbed Ethan's hand, dragging him toward the door. "We have to leave," she cried. They ran to their car, only to find the tires slashed. Desperate, they sprinted down the dirt road, the darkness pressing in around them. Behind them, they heard the humming again, growing louder and closer. As they rounded a bend, they saw headlights approaching. A truck pulled up, and the driver, a middle-aged man, rolled down his window. "You folks okay?" he asked. "Please, just get us out of here," Megan begged. They climbed into the truck, and the driver sped off. As they left the property, Megan glanced back and saw Henry, or whatever he had become, standing at the edge of the woods, watching them. When they reported the incident to the police, they were told the property had been abandoned for years. The last caretaker, Henry, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the previous guests had all left similar complaints about strange noises and sightings. Megan and Ethan never returned to Lakeside Haven, but the memory of that shadowy figure haunted their dreams for years to come. Story 4: The Red Lake House. When Sarah's family decided to rent an Airbnb for their annual family reunion, she was thrilled. It was her turn to plan the event, and she wanted something special, a place that would create lasting memories. After weeks of searching, she found the perfect property: the Red Lake House. The listing described it as a spacious lakeside retreat with 5 bedrooms, a sprawling deck, and private access to a serene red-tinged lake. The photos showed a charming Victorian-style home with a wraparound porch and a cozy interior. The price was surprisingly low for such a large house, but Sarah chalked it up to the off-season. The host, Margaret, was prompt and polite in her messages, assuring Sarah that the house was stocked with everything they'd need for the weekend. There was just one strange note in Margaret's final message: "Please enjoy your stay, but avoid going near the lake after sundown." Sarah assumed it was a safety warning. Maybe the shore was slippery or poorly lit. She didn't give it much thought. The family, including Sarah, her parents, her siblings, and her cousins, arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon. 13 people in total, ranging in age from 5-year-old Emily to their 72-year-old grandmother, Dot. Spirits were high as everyone explored the house, choosing rooms and unpacking. But something about the place immediately unsettled Sarah. The house was beautiful, but it felt stale. The air smelled faintly metallic, and the large windows overlooking the lake seemed to cast unnatural shadows across the floor. The family quickly got to work enjoying the property. They played board games in the living room, grilled burgers on the deck, and laughed as the kids splashed in the shallow waters near the dock. The lake, true to its name, shimmered with a faint red hue. Sarah figured it was due to algae or minerals, and didn't dwell on it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lake seemed to change. Its surface, which had been calm and inviting during the day, now looked darker and more foreboding. The water seemed to ripple even though there was no wind. After dinner, Sarah's father, Tom, suggested taking a walk down to the dock. "It'll be nice to see the stars reflected on the water," he said, but Sarah quickly stopped him. "We're not supposed to go near the lake after dark," she reminded him, repeating Margaret's warning. Tom laughed. "What, is it haunted?" he teased. "Come on, it's just water." Despite his protests, the family stayed inside. They played cards and shared stories late into the night, until one by one, everyone headed to bed. Around midnight, Sarah woke up to the sound of splashing. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but the sound persisted. A soft, rhythmic plunk, plunk, plunk. She climbed out of bed and peered out her bedroom window. To her horror, she saw her father standing on the dock, staring down at the water. The lake seemed to glow faintly, casting an eerie red light on his face. "Dad," she whispered to herself, throwing on her jacket and rushing outside. As she approached the dock, her bare feet crunching on the gravel path, she called out louder. "Dad, what are you doing?" He didn't respond. He stood completely still, his head tilted slightly as though listening to something she couldn't hear. "Dad!" she shouted, grabbing his arm. He flinched and turned to her, his eyes glassy and unfocused. What am I doing out here?" he murmured, his voice thick with confusion. I was asleep." Sarah pulled him back toward the house, her heart pounding. When they reached the living room, she noticed his hands were wet, as if he'd been reaching into the water. "I think you were sleepwalking," she said, trying to reassure him. "Let's just go back to bed." But deep down, she wasn't convinced. Something about the lake had drawn him outside. The next morning, Tom didn't remember the incident. The family spent the day playing games and hiking the nearby trails, but Sarah couldn't shake her unease. She decided not to tell anyone about what had happened, worried it would ruin the mood. That afternoon, 5-year-old Emily began complaining about a woman she'd seen by the lake. "She's really tall, and her dress is all wet," Emily said, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Sarah knelt down to Emily's level. "Where did you see her, sweetheart?" Emily pointed to the dock. "She was standing there, waving at me." Sarah's blood ran cold. "It was probably just a shadow," she said, trying to sound calm. But Emily shook her head. "No," she smiled at me. Her teeth were really big. The adults brushed it off as a child's overactive imagination, but Sarah couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. As the family gathered for dinner, the atmosphere felt tense. The lake, visible through the dining room windows, seemed darker than before, its surface unnervingly still. Even the kids, usually full of energy, were quieter than usual. After dinner, Sarah's cousin Jake decided to test the lake's curse. Laughing and daring the others to join him, he grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the dock. "You guys are way too superstitious," he said. "I'm just going to prove it's fine." Sarah and the others shouted for him to come back, but he ignored them. Minutes passed with no sign of him returning. Finally, Sarah and Ethan grabbed flashlights and went after him. The dock was empty. "Jake!" Ethan called, his voice echoing across the lake. There was no response, only the sound of water lapping against the wooden posts. As they scanned the area with their flashlights, Sarah's beam caught something floating near the shore. She screamed. It was Jake's flashlight, half submerged in the water, its light flickering weakly. Panic spread through the group as they searched the property for Jake. Hours passed with no sign of him. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, it was well past midnight. Sarah, unable to sit idly by, decided to search the lake herself. Ignoring Margaret's warning, she took a small rowboat from the shed and pushed off into the water, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The lake felt alive. The water rippled unnaturally, and the air grew colder the farther she rowed. Then she saw it, something pale beneath the surface, moving slowly. Leaning over the edge, Sarah shined her flashlight into the water. What she saw made her stomach drop. Faces. Dozens of pale, distorted faces stared up at her, their mouths open in silent screams. Among them was Jake, his lifeless eyes wide with terror. The boat lurched violently, nearly tipping her into the water. A pale hand shot up from the lake, grabbing the edge of the boat. Sarah screamed and paddled frantically back to shore, barely escaping the grasping hands that reached for her. By the time Sarah reached the house, she was hysterical. She told the others what she'd seen, but they refused to believe her, until the whispers started. Low, guttural voices echoed through the house, calling their names. The family fled in the middle of the night, leaving their belongings behind. As they drove away, Sarah glanced back at the lake. The pale woman Emily had described stood on the dock, watching them with an eerie smile. Sarah later discovered that the lake had a dark history. Decades ago, it had been the site of multiple drownings, including a group of teenagers who had gone missing during a late-night swim. Locals whispered about the lake being cursed, claiming it pulled people in, feeding on their souls. The Red Lake House was removed from Airbnb shortly after Sarah filed a complaint. She and her family never returned, but the nightmares stayed with them for years. Story 5. The Mirror Room. For their 10th anniversary, Erin and David wanted to do something out of the ordinary. They'd spent their previous anniversaries at luxury resorts or tropical getaways, but this year they decided on something quieter, an intimate retreat in a historic manor. Erin found the perfect place on Airbnb, the Mayfield Manor, located in rural Pennsylvania. The listing described it as a beautifully preserved Victorian home with sprawling gardens, antique furniture, and unique architectural quirks. What caught Erin's attention was the promise of privacy. The house had no neighbors for miles, and the host, Harold, stated in the description that the home was theirs to enjoy without interruption. Erin was excited, but David was skeptical. "It's kinda weird we'd have the whole place to ourselves," he said, scanning the listing. "And why is it so cheap?" "It's probably because it's old," Erin replied. "Besides, it's an adventure." They booked it for a 4-night stay. The house was even more magnificent in person. Set back from the road, it was surrounded by towering oak trees and overgrown gardens that seemed frozen in time. The house itself was grand, with ivy creeping up its stone facade and turrets that gave it a fairy tale-like appearance. The key was left in a lockbox by the door, just as Harold had promised. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wood polish and age. The furniture was antique and ornate, with dark mahogany tables and claw-footed chairs. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, and the walls were adorned with oil paintings of stern-looking people from another era. "This place is incredible," Erin said, running her hand along the intricate banister of the grand staircase. David, however, couldn't stop glancing over his shoulder. "It's a little too quiet," he muttered. As they unpacked and explored the house, Erin noticed one peculiar detail. Nearly every room had a mirror. Some were mounted on the walls, while others leaned on tables or hung over fireplaces. There were hand mirrors, full-length mirrors, and large gilded ones that stretched nearly to the ceiling. "Guess the owners really like mirrors," David said with a shrug. After a long day of travel, the couple settled in for their first night. They cooked dinner in the sprawling kitchen and ate by candlelight in the formal dining room, laughing about the house's old-fashioned charm. David even started to relax, joking about the ghosts that might haunt the place. But as the night wore on, Erin began to feel uneasy. Every time she walked past a mirror, she thought she saw movement, just a flicker in her peripheral vision. She told herself it was just her imagination, the result of being in an unfamiliar, eerie house. Around midnight, as they were getting ready for bed, Erin noticed something strange. One of the mirrors in the hallway, a tall, ornate one with a silver frame, seemed off. The reflection didn't quite match the hallway behind her. The shadows in the mirror were darker, and the angles of the walls seemed distorted. "David," she whispered, grabbing his arm, "do you see that?" David stared at the mirror, frowning. "It's probably just old glass," he said. "They didn't make mirrors like they do now." Still, Erin felt uneasy as they climbed into bed. She turned to face the wall, avoiding the full-length mirror that stood across from their bed. The next morning, Erin decided to explore more of the house, while David went for a run on the property. She climbed the creaky staircase to the 3rd floor, where she found a locked door at the end of the hallway. The doorknob was old and rusted, but to her surprise, it turned easily. Inside, she found what could only be described as the mirror room. The walls were completely covered in mirrors of all shapes and sizes. Even the ceiling was mirrored, creating an overwhelming sense of disorientation. In the center of the room stood a single chair facing the largest mirror, a full-length antique with an intricately carved black frame. Erin stepped closer, her reflection multiplying endlessly in the surrounding mirrors. She felt a strange pull, as though the room was alive, breathing around her. When she reached the chair, she saw something that made her heart stop. In the large mirror, her reflection was sitting in the chair, even though she was standing. The reflection smiled at her, a cold, unnatural smile that didn't match her own. Erin stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug. She fled the room, slamming the door behind her. That night, Erin told David about the mirror room, but he brushed it off as her imagination. "Old houses are creepy. You're probably just spooking yourself," he said. But Erin couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they sat in the living room that evening, she noticed that the mirrors seemed to catch and hold light in strange ways. Reflections lingered a moment too long, and sometimes, when she glanced quickly, she thought she saw something, or someone, standing behind her. David suggested they watch a movie to take her mind off things. As they settled onto the couch, Erin noticed that the large mirror over the fireplace seemed to be tilting slightly forward, as though something heavy was pressing against it from behind. Midway through the movie, the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, and shards of glass flew across the room. David jumped up, shouting, "What the hell was that?" Erin stared at the mirror frame, now empty, as cold air rushed through the room. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadow move in the broken glass, but when she blinked, it was gone. The next day, Erin insisted they leave, but David argued that they were overreacting. "It's just an old house," he said. "Things break." But Erin was firm. "Something's wrong here, David. I can feel it." Reluctantly, he agreed to pack up the next morning. That night, Erin woke to the sound of soft whispers. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The whispers were coming from the full-length mirror across the room. As she stared at it, her reflection stepped out of the mirror. The figure was identical to her, but wrong. Its eyes were too wide, its smile too sharp. It tilted its head, watching her as she scrambled out of bed. David woke to her screams, but by the time he turned on the light, the figure was gone. "I saw it!" Erin sobbed. "It came out of the mirror." David didn't question her this time. They grabbed their bags and left the house in the middle of the night. When Erin tried to contact Harold about the incident, the listing had disappeared from Airbnb. A local historian later told her that Mayfield Manor had a dark past. The original owner, an eccentric artist, was obsessed with mirrors. He believed they were gateways to another world and spent years trying to capture his reflection. Rumors swirled that he had gone mad, locking himself in a room filled with mirrors. When his body was found, every mirror in the house was shattered, and his face was described as frozen in a twisted, unnatural grin. To this day, Erin refuses to stay anywhere with mirrors, even in modern hotels. The memory of her reflection stepping out of the glass haunts her, a reminder that some doorways should never be opened,